In this video, we are going to talk about the three domestic macroeconomic goals, which are low inflation, full employment, and strong and sustainable economic growth, which I will refer to by SSEG. So first, let's look at the goal of low inflation. Is to achieve increase in general price level, also known as CPI, between 2 to 3% on average over time. So why do we care about the goal of low inflation? As we have experienced in 2022 and 2023, we know that high inflation is very damaging to people's financial well-being. From the experience of Japan, which experienced many years of deflation, we can also see how a negative rate of inflation can cause a stagnant economy. So that's why we require a moderate amount of inflation to help the economy to grow at a sustainable pace. So it is important because low inflation is the precondition for achieving government's other objectives. Since low inflation can boost consumer and business confidence, increase international competitiveness, which you know from the previous video would boost aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This helps achieving the goal of full employment and SSEG. So you can actually see there is a connection between the goal of low inflation and full employment, as well as the goal of low inflation and SSEG. So that's why we talk about low inflation first. Without a stable and moderate amount of inflation, it is almost impossible to achieve the other two domestic macroeconomic goals. A natural question you may ask is, why don't we target 0% inflation? So if the price level is not changing, if 1 kilogram of tomato is $2 this year and $2 next year and $2 in 10 years time, what's the problem? And why don't we even target negative rate of inflation? If prices are getting cheaper, that's going to be very good, right? So the reason is RBA doesn't target 0 or negative inflation, because especially for the case of negative inflation, it causes a problem called deferred expenditure. So if you know that the price of certain things you desire is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time, then maybe you won't purchase that product today. Maybe you purchase it in 1 year's time. And then after 1 year, you know it's going to get cheaper the year after as well. So maybe you will never purchase those particular goods or service you desire. So that's a real problem, because we know when the total demand or the aggregate demand of the economy is very weak, then it is not possible to have a strong rate of economic growth, no matter how well your productive capacity is. Because in the short to medium term, it is aggregate demand that determines the rate of economic growth. So this reduces consumption. Shift AD to the left, result in a low level of GDP growth. Another more sinister reason is that by having inflation, real wage can decrease, even if nominal wage remain constant. So businesses can keep cost low. So if inflation is 7% this year, and your income is not changing or only increased by 1%, although you are getting a pay raise, you are actually going backwards. And another problem is people do not like their nominal income to decrease. If your income decreased from $60,000 to $50,000 per year, you would be very, very unhappy. But the alternative scenario is your nominal income is still $60,000 per year, but inflation is at 20%. So you are actually even worse off than the first scenario. But you are not as worried or as sad as the first scenario, because your nominal wage is at least not changing. So this is more to do with human psychology than to do with real economics. But having said that, economics is really something that tries to understand human psychology. So another problem, this is a real problem. So having 0% inflation makes nominal interest rate low. So perhaps when inflation is 3% and the real interest rate is 1%, you can set the nominal rate to 4%. So you have a lot of moving room of interest rate to stimulate the economy. But inflation is 0% and real interest rate is still 1%. The nominal interest rate is 1%. So you have less room to cut interest rate to stimulate the economy. So this is the problem faced by Japan's central bank. The interest rate is already very, very low, and the economy is still performing very badly. And there's really not much the central bank can do, since it's very difficult to lower the interest rate below zero. Because in that case, people may start to withdraw huge amount of cash from bank, which causes bank run and problem like that. So difficult to stimulate the economy. By the means of cut interest rate. So how is inflation measured? So the most common one is CPI. So CPI measures the weighted percentage change in price of a basket of goods and services that represent high proportion of spending for a typical metropolitan household in capital cities. Very important, it is the weighted percentage change. For example, rent contribute a larger percentage contribution to CPI than things like electricity, because you are spending a higher percentage of your income on rent than electricity. So it is a basket of goods and services. It includes services like high school education, university fees, like that, such like that, and represents a high proportion of spending for a typical metropolitan household. So not rural household, it's metropolitan households in big capital cities. So you should be very familiar with this definition. There are many types of inflation. The first one is headline inflation. So it is a very simple measure. It measures the changes in price of all goods and services in the basket. So basically the change in every price weighted by their relative importance to a household spending. Underlying inflation. So there are actually two ways to measure underlying inflation. So the first one is called trimmed mean. So it is the average inflation rate. So imagine you have this distribution of inflation rate. So this represents high change in price. This could be even negative inflation. So you're trimming away the top 15% of goods and services with the highest price increase. And you trim away the bottom 15% with the largest fall in price. And then you take the weighted average of the middle 70% of the price change of different goods and services in your basket. So this is also a similar approach as headline inflation because it takes the weighted average, of course weighted by their relative importance. The second measurement is called weighted median. So imagine the same distribution of price change of all the different goods and services in your basket. I should specify. So this means percentage of price change from positive to negative. And this is the weight. I don't care price change of the goods that are here or here. I only look at the median. So the 50th percentile. And the price change of this particular good is my underlying inflation rate. So now let's look at causes of inflation. There are two causes. So the first one is demand inflation. So this is caused by aggregate demand. So when AD is strong, there are more money chasing fewer goods, which causes inflation. We also have cost inflation. This is caused by higher cost of production, and firms pass on the cost to consumers. So that's the two possible causes of inflation. What are the consequences of high inflation? So the first consequence is erodes purchasing power. Especially if you are on fixed income. So you have a day-to-day job. If you are a business owner, maybe you can pass on some of the inflation to your customers. But if you are, say, work for government or private sector, then you are most likely to earn fixed income. So high inflation means the real wage likely to decrease as wage increase tend to lag behind inflation. Also consider the scenario called bracket creep. So if your nominal income increases to purely compensate inflation, but this pushes you into a higher tax bracket. So essentially you are paying more tax. And after deducting tax, your real level of disposable income may still have decreased, even though your nominal income have increased exactly to compensate inflation. And that's why we often have tax cuts. It's not really cutting the amount of tax, it's just reversing the bracket creep that has occurred during the years. The second problem is misallocation of resources. So investors want to protect their purchasing power. So during periods of high inflation, they prefer assets that hedges or protects against inflation. Some of the notable assets include gold, heritage plates, maybe cryptos, artworks, real estate. The common characteristics of those assets is that they are non-productive assets. So by having gold or by having heritage plates, by having cryptocurrency, artworks, real estate, you are not producing anything. What you are doing is you are hoping that someone else will pay a higher price than you have paid. And this is bad for the economy because we need to actually produce stuff in order for the economy to grow. You need to invest in machineries, you need to invest in factories, you need to invest in research, development. You need to invest in roads, hospitals. If people invest money into those stuff, the economy would not grow. It's just speculative actions. So this is very bad for the economy. And all those productive assets, productive resources goes into these assets. And in the long run, the economy would not grow. Another consequence is distorts savings and investment. So when inflation is high, you prefer to spend money now. It's almost exactly the opposite as what happens during deflation. In countries with hyperinflation, whenever people receive their income, they rush to supermarkets to buy bread, to buy salt, to buy oil. They spend all their income as soon as possible, because if you don't spend them, after 1 hour it's probably worth 50% less. So it encourages spending and discourages saving, because after 1 year or 2 years, your savings would probably be worthless. So no one will save money. So you have less amount of savings overall. And this pushes upward pressure on interest rate. Because at high inflation, firms love to borrow money. If they borrow $10,000 today, maybe it's worth $2,000 tomorrow. So they are essentially getting money for free. And also you have less savings. So you have more demand and less supply. So interest rate would naturally go up. And this discourages investment. So higher interest rate discourages investment, as we have discussed, which reduces aggregate demand in short term. But perhaps more damagingly, it reduces aggregate supply in long term. We know this is particularly damaging because lower aggregate supply essentially limits the ability for economy to grow in the future, and thus reducing future living standards as well. The next factor, international competitiveness. So if you have a very high rate of inflation, this would make your product more expensive relative to others. This only applies when the inflation in your country is particularly higher than inflation in other countries. If everyone have very high rate of inflation, there is actually no change in relative price. So it would not affect the level of international competitiveness of your goods, of the locally produced goods. So when the inflation rate differs, specifically when you have a higher inflation rate than your trading partners, your products become more expensive. So which discourages exports. Also encourages imports because foreign-made goods and services becomes cheaper. So this reduces net exports and reduces the total level of demand in the economy, resulting in a low rate of economic growth. The last factor is called redistributive effect. So if we talk about wealthy people, they do not have all their assets as cash. They usually have, so most of their money are actually in financial assets, such as shares. And shares represents claims to companies. And companies, they are really good at protecting themselves from inflation. And in fact, that's what we have inflation in the first place, is that companies are raising their prices. They are raising the price of cars, raising the price of Coca-Cola, raising the price of vegetables. So the company's profits are actually very well protected during periods of high inflation. So shares actually good protection. Against inflation. Even though the real return from share market is lower in periods of high inflation, but it's still positive historically. So you are almost guaranteed that your nominal, the real purchasing power will be preserved. So for people with low income, they usually hold cash, so they do not have any financial investments. And cash, by definition, inflation causes your purchasing power, the cash on your hand, to depreciate. So wealthy people, they are insulated from high inflation, whereas low income, low wealth individuals are especially vulnerable to high inflation. So this would further increase inequality, because effectively we have this transfer of wealth from low-income households to wealthy households. Because the higher grocery price that low-income households pay, or the higher rent that low-income households pay, they all basically goes to wealthy people. So that's why inflation is particularly harmful for people with low socioeconomic status.